So I thought that I would talk today about memory, and I realized at a memorial service that the topic of memory is not necessarily all of that creative, but I'm not that creative, so yeah, couldn't think of anything else. But thinking back on Granddad's life, I came up with several different adjectives that I could use to describe him. And I've got a story to go along with each of them. And the first is that I've always thought of Granddad as being very thrifty. And later today we'll have Domino's Pizza, which was sort of a family pastime. And one of the things that Granddad would always do is that he would take inventory of all of the pizza that was left over, who had eaten what and how many pieces and what toppings each person had had, so that the next time he could more accurately order so there would be no waste. It's that sort of attention to detail that was a hallmark of Granddad's. And probably about it's been more than that, 10 years ago, I was over at their house, and I had noticed that there was a grid coordinate chart drawn out on the refrigerator. It was laminated, and he had a grease pencil sitting next to the refrigerator. Why are you laughing? I asked him what it was for, and he said that was his system to keep track of where the dog had done its business in the backyard. He had counted out fence posts and made a battleship-looking tracking system so that later he'd go back and pick it up, and he would mark it with the grease pencil while the dog was out there. Now, the third thing that describes Granddad is a sense of humor. Granddad was always making jokes, making gags. He'd be wiggling his ears or rattling off some sort of joke. And my dad was telling me a story this morning about Granddad that I thought would be good to share. And that was that in the last few months at the nursing home, my dad had gone over to visit him and had taken him on a walk in his wheelchair, pushing him up and down the hall. And when they left his room, Granddad asked if they were going to go see any pretty girls. And my dad said, I don't know, let's see. And by the time they got to the end of the hall, he was asleep. And finally, punctuality is a great way to describe Granddad, with his sense of timing. Several years ago, I asked Grandma if they'd ever been late to anything in their lives, and she stopped and kind of looked up and thought, no, I don't think so. Now, Rachel and I are perpetually late. I think that we've probably been late more times we've been on time. So this is clearly not a trait that I inherited. But that sense of timing is what, I think this was on purpose, I'm not sure, allowed them to have two sons, both born on November 30th in 2 different years. Now, we were here just 7 short months ago for Grandma's memorial service, and the timing on this was impeccable, I think, in a way, because neither one of them had to grieve the other's loss. Many of you who visited Granddad in the last year and a half may have noticed his progressing Alzheimer's that he was dealing with, and the fact that Grandma died first in a very peaceful way, and Granddad's memory problems as a result of Alzheimer's really prevented him from ever having to grieve her loss. And I think we can both be grateful, or we can all be grateful, that neither one of them ever had to experience the other's death. So, his lack of memory there contributed to a really good thing there at the end. Now, one thing that I wanted to do was, Rachel and I have this book. We're both photographers, as most of you know. And this is a book called Photosynthesis, and it was written by a friend of ours who's a photojournalist. Used to work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And in the introduction of this book, he talks about a picture that he took of his grandfather, and I wanted to read the introduction here real quick. My grandfather was an ordinary man with an ordinary name, John Smith. He was a carpenter who built plain, solid houses for plain, solid people like himself. When he put away his tools at the age of 87, he said it was the hardest thing that he ever had to do. I did it for her, he told me, speaking of Edna, his wife of more than 60 years. She needs me here. My grandfather's hands were work-roughened and hard, but his manner was tender. I never heard him raise his voice to anyone. He was 95 when he died quietly in his sleep, of nothing in particular, in a hospital bed in the little Indiana town where he was born. You won't discover any newspaper stories about John Smith, not even his little hometown weekly paper, because he never did anything remotely newsworthy. He loved his wife and his family, he worked hard, and he kept the Sabbath. There's almost nothing left of him now, just memories and photographs. A few pictures my brother made of our grandfather, when our grandfather came to help add a room in my father's house. Others I made on Christmases and birthdays, and during our 2 infrequent weekend visits. These photographs are memories made visible and tangible. I have one that I keep in a frame of John and Edna standing on their porch, watching us pull away in our car. They always stood there, steadying themselves on the porch railing, until we were out of sight, as if cherishing every moment spent with us. That image rekindles fond memories, even when my mind is numbed by the daily routine. I get home after a long day and a tiring commute, and the last thing on my mind is the way that my grandfather laughed when I beat him at chess. And then I walk through the living room and I see that photograph, and I remember. I can remember without the picture, of course, but the picture helps me remember to remember. So this is Brian's picture of his grandparents. But I've got one too, which I took at Christmas in 2003, and it hangs on my wall in our house in Atlanta, and our staircase. And I walk past this several times a day. And this picture helps me remember Grandma and Granddad as they were. And so what we did was we made some prints that we're going to pass out. So each of you can have a copy of this image, and so that you can remember to remember.